Hey guys, today we're talking about Ulysses S. Grant. He was a West Point graduate, the general of the Union Army during the American Civil War, and a two-term president. He was also taken for everything he was worth by a confidence man named Ferdinand Ward. Okay, so the year is 1879, and a young financier named Ferdinand Ward meets Ulysses S. Grant Jr. in New York City. Ward gets Grant to go in on some commodity speculations with him, and the next thing you know, he's saying, hey, we should really join forces and start a proper investment firm. Grant isn't sure, but after Ward assures him that J.D. Fish, president of Marine Bank, will be involved, he agrees. From the start, this has the makings of a financial super team. The press had begun calling Ward the Napoleon of Wall Street. You've got J.D. Fish, who's the president of a bank, and then you've got Grant Jr., who's the son of a president. Of course, soon enough, they pull in Ulysses Sr., who's more commonly known as General Grant. And the general must have either really liked the pitch or must have had a huge amount of trust in his son's judgment, because not only does he go in, but he legitimately YOLOs it. They said that he put all his savings, or about $100,000, into the firm of Grant and Ward. Oh, and Jr. also had just gotten married to the daughter of a U.S. Senator, Jerome B. Chafee, so they got to add his name as well. Altogether, they seed the firm with about $400,000, and that's the equivalent today's dollars of about $10 million. And even though it's a four-person team, Grant Jr. is trusting Ward with all the finances, and General Grant is trusting his son, meaning that really it's just a one-man operation, and we'll get to Fish a little bit later. So 3 years go by, and the firm is managing $15 million all of a sudden. Ferdinand Ward didn't even have to do any marketing, but they have people throwing money at them thanks to the word-of-mouth network. A guy would go in, make a deposit with Grant and Ward, get one look at his statement a few months later, and then just start telling all of his friends about this great deal he's got. How good were these profits? So, as recounted in the book 28 Years in Wall Street from 1886, one particular investor gave $50,000 to Grant and Ward, took a trip over to Europe, and after several months he comes back and finds out that he's got $250,000. The profits were so good that, although he'd taken his money out of the firm upon returning from his trip, he decided that it was better to put it all back in. That way, he figured it would multiply again, and next time, it'd make him a millionaire. Ward was definitely pleased with this, because it's exactly what your clients need to do if you have any hope of keeping your Ponzi scheme going. Yeah, in case it wasn't obvious already, the profits were a sham. Technically, though, no one would have called this a Ponzi scheme because at the time, Charles Ponzi was 2 years old. Since the idea didn't fully exist yet, articles described the situation after the fact, calling it the most extraordinary game of bluff that the nation had ever seen, a stupendous scheme of paying profits from a principal which was never invested or which went to pay some clamorous debtor. Just in case you think that this makes Ward the OG pyramid schemer, though, he actually gets beaten to the punch by a woman named Adele Spitzeder in Europe by about 10 years. And actually, in the US also, a woman named Sarah Howe started something called the Ladies' Deposit, which was started just a couple years before Ward's scheme. 28 Years on Wall Street describes Ward as an evil genius with a remarkable ability to find gullible victims who then he turned into walking advertisements for his services. But his whole operation didn't seem too cunning to me, because as they later go on to explain it really only had two components. First, they say, "It is marvelous how the idea of large profits, when presented to the mind in a plausible light, has the effect of stifling suspicion." And what if anyone was suspicious? That was maybe the one genius part. Ward just explained that a lot of his investments were tied to government contracts, and because of that, he had to keep them a secret. That was basically it. So, as with most Ponzi schemes, things go well until they don't. One day, Ward shows up and asks Grant Jr., hey, tell your dad that Marine Bank needs $150,000 because it's about to go under. And Jr. asks him, why should they care about Marine Bank? And he gets told that, well, they're holding a bunch of our money, and if they go down, we should be able to get it back, but it's going to look bad and there's going to be some delays. Now remember, the general doesn't have $150,000. He put everything that he had into the bank, but he does have connections. He's a bona fide war hero and former president of the United States, after all. So he goes to his friend William H. Vanderbilt and explains to him what's going on. Vanderbilt is the wealthiest man in the world at the time, and he says that he's heard Marine Bank has got some sketchy business going on, but he's willing to make a personal loan to Grant instead for that amount, kind of as a thank you for his service to the country. So Grant gives the money to his son gives it to Ward, they deposit it in the bank. Everything seems good, but then Ward shows up again and tells Grant Jr. that all of a sudden Marine Bank needs $500,000. So Grant Jr. tries to handle this himself, and he goes to Jay Gould, who is another one of the world's richest men. Gould turns him away, though. He doesn't want anything to do with it. So Grant Jr. then goes to the lawyer of his father-in-law, the senator, who says something seems suspicious here. So together they go to Ward, and the lawyer demands that the senator's funds come out of Grant and Ward. Ward says, sure, no problem. Meet me at the office tomorrow. So the next day, they go to the office, and Ward is gone. Soon after, they're all trying to figure out what's happening, and they get word that Marine Bank has failed, in part because Grant and Ward's accounts are all overdrawn. And finally, when they open the safe at Grant and Ward, they discover the firm only has maybe a couple $100,000 in assets despite carrying $15 million on the books. So Grant and Ward fails that same day also. General Grant is destroyed by this. He loses his life savings. He also loses the $150,000 that he now owes Vanderbilt, and he even loses his principles. He says, quote, I have made it a rule of my life to trust a man long after other people gave him up, but now I don't see how I can ever trust any human being again. Even worse, if you can get worse than that, he suffers a major blow to his reputation when some accuse him of luring them into the fraud. J.D. Fish has a letter signed by General Grant that is assuring him Ward and Grant is in good standing, which Fish then uses to secure financing for Grant and Ward from other banks and other investors. It turns out that Grant didn't write or even read the letter. Fish realized a letter would be good for business and collaborated with Ward on writing it. Then they stuck it into a bunch of other papers that General was meant to sign, and he ended up signing it. So at worst, he was guilty of acting somewhat irresponsibly, but it definitely wasn't a good look, and it took a while for that to be settled in the courts. So the Grants escape jail time, but there's still the $150,000 that's owed to Vanderbilt. And to settle it, General Grant basically gives him everything. It starts with a bunch of property that he owns that covers a lot of the $150,000, but by the end of it, it gets down to him returning things like swords presented to him by citizens after the war, and all the little knickknacks and gifts he picked up on his world tour to places like China and Japan. He really does give everything to settle the debt. Oh, and it also turns out that he gets diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. But his story isn't quite over. See, he was friends with Mark Twain, who convinces him to write an autobiography. The plan was to be able to provide for his family after he'd passed, and so Grant spent his final days writing. He completes the book just 5 days before his death. And though he would never see it, the book went on to sell hundreds of thousands of copies, reestablishing the Grant family fortune at a level higher than it had ever been prior to the scandal, and is critically lauded to this day. Finally, after his death, Vanderbilt, who of course he's the wealthiest man in the world, didn't really need the $150,000, returned Grant's personal belongings to his widow, instructing her to donate them to the newly opened National Museum. Now called the Grant Vanderbilt Collection, these items helped establish an important tradition of donating important historical objects to the Smithsonian. I bet he would have liked that. Thanks for watching, guys.